Hey y'all, it's your girl T, and welcome back to Purpose Through Pain. Thank you for being here with me for another conversation. Today, I want to talk to you about something that I think a lot of us struggle with, but we don't always talk about. We don't talk about it enough. Boundaries, more specifically, setting boundaries without feeling guilty about them. And when I say boundaries, I'm not talking about shutting everybody out. I'm not talking about becoming cold. I'm not talking about treating people badly. I'm talking about learning how to communicate what you will and will not accept, what you are comfortable with, what you're not comfortable with, and what you are willing to do when someone crosses that line. Because I've learned that setting a boundary is one thing. Actually, standing on that boundary is something completely different. And that's hard. And that's where it really gets hard. It's hard because sometimes you can know exactly what you need to say, but you struggle with saying it. Sometimes you know something isn't good for you, but you are afraid of how somebody is going to react when you finally speak up. And sometimes you already know the boundary needs to be there, but guilt makes you second guess yourself. And I think that's something a lot of us can relate to. What you guys think? Because some of us were never taught how to set a boundary. We were taught to be respectful. We were taught to be helpful. We were taught to be there for family. We were taught to take care of people. We were taught to forgive. We were taught to give people chances. But sometimes nobody taught us that we are allowed to have limits too. And I think that's where I had to do a lot of learning because there were times when I would allow things that I probably shouldn't even have allowed. I would let things slide. I would give people another chance. You remember I told you about them chances in the last episode? Chance after chance after chance, another chance. And sometimes I would stay quiet because I didn't want to hurt somebody's feelings. You guys, have you ever just not said nothing just because you don't want to hurt the person's feelings? So you give them a chance, right? I didn't want to create an argument. I didn't want somebody to think I was being, difficult. I didn't want somebody to think I had changed. So instead of saying what I really felt, I would just deal with it. And let me tell you something. Just because you can deal with it sometimes doesn't mean you should have to. That's something I had to learn. Yeah, this community is going to be a lot of things that we have to learn. We got to learn and we have to unlearn, you know? It's a part of the healing, growing, evolving, becoming. Because listen, sometimes we become so good at tolerating things that we forget we're actually allowed to say, this doesn't work for me. And that's a boundary. You don't have to scream. You don't have to argue. You don't have to disrespect anybody. You could simply say, I ain't comfortable with that. I don't want to do that. That's not something I'm willing to accept. I need some space. And you know what? You don't always have to give a long explanation behind it. That's another thing I had to learn. Stop explaining yourself. It is what it is. If you setting a boundary, you setting a boundary for yourself. Sometimes I felt like I had to explain myself so much because I wanted people to understand, why I was saying no. But the older I get, the more I realize no doesn't always need a paragraph behind it. Sometimes no is just no, simply no. And that doesn't make you rude. It doesn't make you selfish. It doesn't make you a bad person. It just means you know your limit. And I think one of the hardest parts about setting boundaries is when somebody doesn't respect the boundary. Because there's two sides to this thing. Because it's easy to say, I'm setting a boundary. But what happens when somebody says, I'm going to do what I want to do anyway? The crossover, that boundary. What happens when someone gets angry? What happens when someone tries to guilt trip on you? What happens when they say, you never used to act like that before, or you change, or what's wrong with you? And I had to learn that sometimes people aren't necessarily upset because the boundary is wrong. Sometimes they're upset because they were comfortable with you having no boundaries at all. And that's a big difference. Because when somebody has used and used to, having unlimited access to you, and you all of a sudden establish, limits, they may not like it, but their reaction doesn't automatically mean you're wrong. It doesn't. And that's where the guilt can come from. It can, guilt come from, because you start thinking, maybe was I too harsh? Maybe should I just let it go? Maybe I should have done, what they wanted me to do. And before you know it, you're backtracking on the very boundary you knew you needed. Listen, and I've done that before, set a boundary and then go against my own boundary, go against, what I said that I wasn't going to allow, myself or no one else to cross. But listen, that's why I wanted to talk to you about the word guilt, because guilt can make you believe you're doing something wrong when you're actually doing something healthy and right for yourself. Sometimes guilt is just the feeling that comes with doing something differently than you've always done. And if you spent years saying yes, saying no might feel uncomfortable. If you spent years being available, taking a step back might feel uncomfortable. If you spent years putting everybody else's feelings before your own, finally considering your own feelings might feel uncomfortable. But uncomfortable doesn't automatically mean wrong. Sometimes uncomfortable means you're learning something new. And I think that's what boundaries, have done for me. A learning experience. I'm learning that I can love people and still have limits. I can respect people and still disagree with them. I can forgive somebody and still decide that certain behavior isn't acceptable to me. Period. I can care about somebody and still tell them, no, nah, I can't, I'm not, and I won't. And I think that's important because boundaries aren't about controlling other people. That's something I really want to make clear. A boundary isn't you can't do this. A boundary is if this happens, this is what I'm going to do. That's the difference. Let me say this. For example, if somebody constantly speaks to me disrespectfully, my boundary isn't necessarily, you better stop talking to me like that. My boundary might be, if the conversation becomes disrespectful, I'm going to remove myself from the conversation. That's something I can control. I can't control how somebody else behaves, but I can control what I do in response to it. Listen to that again. That right there, that's a boundary. And boundaries can look different depending on the situation. It could be a boundary with family, a boundary with a friend, a boundary in a relationship, boundary at work, a boundary with someone who constantly calls you only when they need something, a boundary with somebody who drains your energy every time you talk to them, a boundary with someone who disrespects and doesn't respect your time, a boundary with someone who keeps bringing the same drama into your life. And sometimes the boundary is simply, I can't keep participating in this. That's okay. Now, I know somebody listening might be thinking, but T, what if I love them? What if it's my family? What if we, been friends for years? What if we've been together for a long time? What if I don't want to lose this person? And I understand all that from experience. But here's something I'm learning. Love doesn't mean you have to accept everything. You can love somebody and still have boundaries with them. Actually, sometimes boundaries are necessary because you want the relationship to be healthier. Because without a boundary, resentment can build. And when you constantly say yes, when you really mean no, when you constantly tolerate things that hurt you, when you constantly ignore your own feelings, eventually something happens. You become frustrated, you become exhausted, you become resentful, and then people wonder what happened. Well, a lot happened. It just happened quietly. And that's why I believe boundaries are important because I'd rather communicate my limit than silently building resentment towards somebody. I'd rather say this isn't okay with me than keep pretending everything is fine. I'd rather have an uncomfortable conversation today than carry years of frustration tomorrow. And another thing I'm learning is that boundaries have to be consistent because if somebody's something isn't acceptable, because if I tell somebody something isn't acceptable to me, but every time they do it, I keep allowing it, then I'm teaching them that my boundary isn't really a boundary. And that's something I'm still, you know, I ain't, listen, I'm not perfect. This is not a perfect world over here. So sometimes we won't fall short, but boundaries are very important. Setting boundaries is not just about what you say, it's about what you are willing to follow on through with. It could be hard, especially when you love somebody, especially when you don't want conflict, especially when you are afraid of losing somebody. But sometimes protecting your peace requires you to be uncomfortable for a little while, and that's okay. So, if you're listening to this and you've been struggling with boundaries, I want you to start small. You don't have to change everything overnight. Start by paying attention to the things that constantly makes you uncomfortable. Pay attention to the things that leave you drained. Pay attention to the situations where you keep saying yes when you really want to say no. Pay attention to the people who constantly cross lines you already communicate. And then ask yourself, what boundaries do I need to set here? Maybe it's saying no. Maybe it's taking a step back. Maybe it's limiting how you often communicate with somebody. Maybe it's refusing to participate in certain conversations. Maybe it's protecting your time, protecting your privacy. Maybe it's simply learning how to say, I can't do that today. And I'm not feeling like you have to apologize for it. Because listen, you are allowed to have limits. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to protect your peace, protect your time, protect your space, protect your energy. You are allowed to decide what behavior you will and you will not accept, period. And you don't have to feel guilty about every boundary you set because sometimes the guilt isn't telling you that you're doing something wrong. Sometimes the guilt is just reminding you that you're doing something different. So I want to leave you with a few questions. What boundaries have you been afraid to set? What have you been tolerating? because you don't want to disappoint somebody. Where in life do you need to speak up? And maybe the biggest question, what would change if you stop feeling guilty for having limits? Think about that. Because boundaries aren't about building walls around yourself, they're about creating healthy lines around the things that matter to you: your time, your space, your relationship, your peace, your life. And learning how to communicate those limits doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you honest, it makes you aware, and sometimes it makes you healthier. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this conversation spoke with you, please share it. I need you guys to comment, like, please share this episode with someone who may need to hear it. And I want to hear back from you guys. Tell me, talk to me. What's one boundary you've had to learn to set? Leave comments. Let's talk about it because this is Purpose to Pain. Real stories, real conversations, real growth. And you already know I'm your girl T. And remember, where you start is not where you're going to finish. I'll see you guys next Thursday. Thank you for joining in.